I remember the light first. Not the phone call, not the funeral home, not even the casseroles people kept dropping off in foil pans I never asked for. I remember the light in Daniel's study 2 days after we buried him. It came in flat through the west-facing windows and stretched across his desk in a pale band, catching dust where he would have hated to see it. Daniel liked clean surfaces, ordered stacks, pens aligned, bills clipped together. I was sitting in his leather chair with a cup of coffee. I had reheated twice and still hadn't touched when Victor said, "We need to go over the estate now." He said it the way some men say, "We need to move the car," or "We need to sign for the package." No hesitation, no softness, just a task to be completed. Ryan stood a little behind him, one hand in his pocket, the other resting against the edge of Daniel's bookshelf. He had that look people use when they want to appear gentle without actually offering comfort. "I know this is a hard week," he said, "but some things can't wait." I don't think I answered right away. I remember looking past them, toward the framed photograph on Daniel's credenza. The one from our trip to Cape Cod years ago. He was laughing in that picture, half turned away from the camera, as if someone had said something he couldn't resist correcting. He had a way of laughing, like he was about to argue with the room. Victor opened a folder and set it on the desk. That's when the room went quiet. Not because no one was speaking. They were. Victor had already started on property values and account designations and what he called efficient transfer. But something in me went still. There is a kind of silence that isn't peace, it's measurement. It's the moment your mind stops listening to tone and starts listening to structure. He told me the main house in Bellevue was going to him and Ryan jointly. The mountain property outside Leavenworth as well. The business interests too. Daniel's operating shares, the warehouse, the reserves connected to one of his holding companies. He named numbers with the practiced ease of someone who had repeated them before arriving. Then I asked, "And me?" Ryan cleared his throat, like he was embarrassed on my behalf. Victor didn't flinch. "There's an insurance payout, $280,000. That should give you flexibility while you make plans. Make plans." After 21 years of marriage, after the hospital nights and the medication charts and the stack of legal pads where I tracked every dosage and specialist and referral, I was being told to make plans. He went on, said I'd be allowed to remain in the house for 30 days. Said there were medical balances still unsettled, and that because I had signed some treatment authorizations, portions of those obligations might fall to me personally. He made it sound regrettable, almost administrative, like rain on a moving day. At the time, I didn't think much about the phrasing. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood, because what was missing from the room wasn't grief. It was authority. Not volume, not confidence. Authority. Neither of Daniel's sons sounded like men carrying out their father's settled wishes. They sounded like men getting ahead of a process. I remember folding my hands in my lap so they wouldn't see them shake. Victor kept talking. Ryan added things here and there in that low, almost sympathetic voice of his. 30 days, insurance, debt allocation, next steps, their lawyer, their suggested timeline. Some people mistake silence for permission. That sentence came into my mind then, clear as glass. I didn't say it out loud. I just sat there and listened until they were done. When they left, Victor touched the folder once more and said, "It would help everyone if we moved quickly. Help everyone." I waited until their car backed out of the driveway and turned at the top of the cul-de-sac before I stood up. The house was too clean in the unnatural way houses become after a death. People wipe surfaces, straighten chairs, stack sympathy cards, and call it help. But the result is a kind of staged calm. You can feel the disruption under it. I walked back into Daniel's study and opened the top right drawer of his desk. Then the middle one, then the shallow left drawer where he kept stamps, old reading glasses, and receipts he never threw away. I wasn't looking for anything specific yet. I was just trying to feel where the truth might still be sitting. Under an envelope from a vineyard membership we never used often enough, I found a small brass key. It was heavier than it looked, warm from the room, old enough that the ridges were slightly worn. I turned it over in my palm and thought, that doesn't belong to anything in this house. That was the first small detail I couldn't explain. It would have been easy to dismiss if I had been another kind of woman. But grief does strange things. It blurs some instincts and sharpens others. Mine, for whatever reason, had sharpened around paper and locks and phrasing. I didn't call Victor. I didn't call Ryan. I didn't call anyone. I put the key in the zippered compartment of my purse, closed Daniel's desk, and wrote down 3 things on the back of an unopened condolence card. Insurance amount, medical balances, 30 days, procedure before reaction. That was all I could manage that day. The next morning I called Daniel's longtime attorney, Arthur Pell. Arthur had known Daniel for nearly 15 years. He had the careful voice of a man who had spent his career telling wealthy clients things they did not want to hear, in language they could tolerate. His office was in downtown Seattle, on the 9th floor of a building with too much reflective glass and a lobby that always smelled faintly of eucalyptus. When I sat down across from him, he took one look at me and said, "Margaret, before we discuss anything else, I need to advise you not to sign a single document this week." I think I smiled, but only because the sentence arrived too late to be comforting. He had already reviewed the copy of the will Victor had emailed over. He said there were irregularities, timing issues, drafting language that didn't sound like Daniel, a sequence of revisions Arthur had never been asked to prepare. "Could we contest it?" I asked. "We could," he said. "But that's not the same as saying you should. Contesting means time, and time means expense, and expense creates pressure." He said pressure the way an engineer might say structural failure, very evenly. I asked him how long. He said months, maybe longer. Outside his window, the water looked silver grey, and ferries moved across Elliott Bay like toys on a track. I remember thinking how strange it was that the city could continue with such confidence, while my own life had been reduced to clauses and deadlines. And that wasn't the part that stayed with me most. The part that stayed with me was how unsurprised Arthur sounded. Concerned, yes, but not shocked, as if he had already sensed something was off before I ever walked in. On the way home, I passed a florist on Mercer Street and remembered the first of the 3 scenes that still come back to me whenever I think about Daniel's sons. It was early in our marriage. Winter, I think, maybe the 2nd year. Daniel had come in from the garage, smelling like cold air and motor oil because he had been trying to fix the old lawn tractor himself instead of calling someone. He dropped a paper bag on the kitchen counter. Inside was a loaf of rosemary bread from the bakery near our first condo. Ryan was in college then. Victor, already out on his own. Daniel kissed my cheek and said, "I know it isn't dinner, but it's still a peace offering." "A peace offering for what?" I asked. He smiled without looking at me. "For raising sons who think gratitude is optional. We ate the bread warm with butter while rain hit the windows." It wasn't a dramatic conversation, just one of those small marital moments that settle into the body, a shared understanding. A sentence that sounds casual until years later when it stops sounding casual at all. That memory didn't make me cry. It made me angry. By the time I got home, Victor had left a voicemail. Warm tone, measured, asking whether Arthur had helped clarify expectations. That word again, expectations. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and let it sit there ringing once more before the screen went dark. That night I made soup from the freezer because I couldn't bear to cook something from scratch and have no one taste it. Halfway through, I remembered another scene. This one from Daniel's recovery after his first heart procedure. We were in the den. He was in his recliner with a blanket over his legs, the television muted. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic because I had just wiped the side table down. Victor had come by that afternoon, stood near the doorway, and said, "You should really think about putting major assets into a cleaner structure while you still can." While you still can. Daniel looked up slowly and said, "You mean while I'm still alive?" Victor laughed like it was business talk, nothing more. But Daniel did not laugh back. After Victor left, Daniel picked up the remote, muted the baseball game again, though it was already muted, and said, "That boy only gets efficient when there's something he wants." I remember tucking the blanket more firmly around his knees. "He's worried." "No," Daniel said, "he's counting." At the time, I thought it was harsh. Later, I understood it wasn't harsh enough. The next morning, Ryan texted me asking if we could all meet for lunch and keep things smooth. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened Daniel's wallet, which had been returned to me in a plastic hospital envelope, and looked through every folded paper inside. Behind an old membership card from a private club he almost never used, I found a cream-colored bank card with no account number on the front. Just the name, North Cascade Private Bank, and a handwritten notation on the sleeve behind it. Box 214. That's when something shifted. I drove there that same afternoon. North Cascade Private Bank sat on a quiet street in Tacoma, in a building that looked more like an old law office than a bank. Brick exterior, brass handles, carpet thick enough to absorb footsteps. The manager, a woman named Elaine, with careful lipstick and practical shoes, checked my ID twice, then once more against the file. "Yes," she said finally, "you are listed for access." She didn't ask questions. People in that line of work know the value of quiet. The safety deposit room was smaller than I expected. Just a table, 2 chairs, muted lighting, and the kind of air that always feels slightly cooler than the rest of the building. The box itself was deeper than most. When I lifted the lid, I saw stacked envelopes, 2 folders, a flash drive, and 1 sealed letter with my name written in Daniel's hand. For a few seconds, I only stared. Then I picked up the top folder. The first document was a set of account statements for a holding entity I had never heard of. Morrison Ridge Capital, LLC. The balance spread across linked accounts came to $5.3 million. I thought there had to be some mistake. I checked the name again. Daniel's signature. Daniel's tax references. Transfer histories over several months. It was real. Under that sat emails, printed, flagged. One of them was between Victor and a man named Leonard Sykes. The message referred to accelerating trust revisions and securing transfer control before his condition worsens. Another asked, "What exposure remains if Margaret asks for full inventory? What exposure remains?" I sat back in the chair and felt the blood drain from my face. There was more. A surveillance report from a licensed investigator, casino visits tied to Victor, debt summaries, separate records connected to Ryan's consulting company showing client funds moved through side accounts, civil complaints not yet filed but clearly forming, notes in Daniel's handwriting in the margins, dates circled, questions underlined twice. Then I opened the second folder. Inside was a new will, dated 6 weeks before Daniel died. It left everything to me. Not most things. Not enough to be polite. Everything. With one clause that made me read the page twice. I leave to my wife, Margaret Whitaker, sole discretion regarding whether my sons shall receive any real property or business-related interests, trusting her judgment as to what they have earned. I remember staring at that sentence long enough that the room itself seemed to recede. I finally opened Daniel's letter. He wrote that if I was reading it, then Victor and Ryan had behaved exactly as he feared they would. He apologized for not telling me everything sooner, said he needed certainty before acting, and explained that he had quietly shifted liquid assets out of structures his sons monitored. He had also placed substantial liens and mortgages on the properties they expected to inherit. The Bellevue house carried debt, The mountain property did too. So did the warehouse and adjacent commercial parcel. On paper, they looked valuable. In practice, they were burdened, Daniel wrote, in a sentence that still makes me hear his voice. They wanted the shell. I kept the structure. I laughed once when I read that. Just once. Not because it was funny, exactly. Because it was so entirely him. He also explained that Arthur Pell was no longer the controlling estate attorney. Daniel had moved key filings and originals to another firm in Tacoma after he learned someone from Arthur's office may have been sharing timing information with Victor. He wasn't accusing Arthur directly. Daniel was always precise about that sort of distinction, but he had changed the process. At the bottom of the letter, he wrote, "Don't argue with them emotionally. Let procedure do the talking." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then my phone buzzed. Ryan. "Just checking in. Hope you're okay." I stayed in that small room another 40 minutes, maybe longer. Grief and clarity are unusual companions, but they can sit beside each other if the room is quiet enough. By the time I left the bank, I knew 3 things. First, Daniel had not abandoned me. Second, his sons had moved too early. Third, I would not warn them. That evening, I agreed to dinner at Ryan's house in Medina. His wife, Lauren, greeted me at the door with the brittle brightness of someone who knew there was money in the room and didn't want to scare it away. The house smelled like lemon polish and expensive candles. The dining table was already set. Victor was there, of course, in a navy blazer, despite it being a family meal. Some men dress for influence even in their own kitchens. Ryan poured wine and asked how I was holding up. I said, "Tired," which was true in more ways than one. Dinner was halibut with some sort of herb crust and asparagus, too thin to hold much flavour. Lauren talked too much about school fundraising. Victor kept circling back to timing, paperwork, transition, operational continuity for the business. He used phrases like prudent handoff and fiduciary discipline, while I sat there knowing he had casino markers and private debt notes hidden beneath all that polished language. About halfway through the meal, I said, "I found a few documents in Daniel's study I didn't recognize." Ryan's fork stopped midway. Victor set down his glass. "What kind of documents?" "Oh, some bank records, a key, possibly a deposit box number." I haven't sorted through it. Lauren looked between the 3 of us and then toward the kitchen, as if deciding whether dessert could be served early enough to interrupt the moment. Victor leaned back. "You shouldn't burden yourself with technical records right now. That's what counsel is for." "That's what counsel is for." I nodded. Maybe. Though Daniel always liked me to understand where things stood. Ryan smiled too fast. "Of course. We just don't want anyone taking advantage of you while you're vulnerable." I let that sit on the table between us. Then I said, very gently, "I may ask for a full accounting of all medical balances before I sign anything." Ryan dropped his napkin. Not dramatically, just enough. Victor recovered first. "That's unnecessary. We already reviewed those." "I'm sure you did," I said. "But I'd still like to see them." The rest of dinner never quite recovered. People kept speaking, but the performance had split at the seam. Victor walked me to my car afterward and said, "If you found any estate-related materials, they should be turned over promptly." I smiled at him. Family should always keep each other informed. He didn't know whether to hear that as agreement or warning. The next morning I met with the new attorney Daniel had named in his letter. Her name was Helena Cross. Her office in Tacoma was smaller than Arthur's and infinitely steadier. No glass conference walls, no statement furniture, just old wood shelves, a long table, and the hum of a copy machine from somewhere in the back. There was also a paralegal at the front desk named Denise, who wore reading glasses on a chain and addressed everyone as if deadlines had moral significance. I liked her immediately. Helena read the clause aloud to me from Daniel's final will, calmly, without emphasis. I leave sole discretion to my wife. Procedure does not bend when it's written clearly enough. She then showed me the recorded liens and loan instruments attached to the Bellevue house, the mountain property, and the warehouse parcel. Legal, enforceable, current. She also walked me through the transfer mechanics. If I chose to deed those properties to Victor and Ryan, the obligations would go with them. They would have a short window to assume, refinance, or default. And with their known debt profiles? I asked. Helena removed her glasses. Refinancing would be difficult. That was a careful lawyer's phrase for impossible. Before I left, she said, "One more thing. If they continue making representations about an outdated will, that creates exposure for them, especially if they know it's outdated." I thought about Victor's confidence in Daniel's study, the speed, the polished numbers, the 30-day timeline presented like a settled fact. "Then let them keep talking," I said. That afternoon began what I still think of as the two-lane period. The financial lane moved first. Helena's office notified the title company, the bank, and the commercial lender of a contested presentation issue involving obsolete estate documents. Nothing dramatic, just enough to stop quiet assumptions from hardening into transaction reality. Escrow review flags were placed on the house and mountain property. Certain account instructions were frozen, pending confirmation of estate authority. The paperwork already had my name on it, not publicly, not loudly, but where it mattered. Within hours, Victor left me 2 voicemails, the first controlled, the second sharper. He said third parties were interfering, said Helena Cross was creating needless confusion, said Daniel would never have wanted delay. I didn't answer. Instead, I went to the grocery store because real life has a habit of continuing while legal structure rearranges itself. In produce, I ran into our neighbor, Joanne, who touched my wrist and said, "I saw Victor's car here twice this week." "Hope everything's all right," I told her. "We're sorting paperwork." She gave me a look that said she understood more than the words aloud. The next morning, the financial lane moved again. Helena forwarded me the first lender response. Formal acknowledgement that no transfer or encumbrance release would proceed without verified authority under the controlling will. Then a second email from a private banking officer confirming that Daniel's reserved accounts were insulated and accessible only through my designation. By that point, the pattern was clearer than ever. And then came the pressure. Ryan called crying, not loudly, not convincingly, but enough to try to trigger a different version of me, the smoothing over version. The woman who kept holidays intact and sent thank you notes, and believed that if she stayed soft long enough, other people might someday become fair. "Margaret," he said, "Victor's upset and things are getting messy. Can we just sit down without lawyers and be a family for 1 hour?" I stood at the kitchen counter holding the phone in one hand and a damp dish towel in the other. Sunlight hit the faucet. Somewhere outside, someone was trimming hedges. "No," I said, "we can't." He was quiet for a beat. "So that's how it is." I looked out the window at Daniel's herb boxes, half neglected now, rosemary gone woody at the base. "No, Ryan, this is just how paperwork works." That's when everything changed for him, I think. He heard that I wasn't fighting emotionally. I was locating the floor under my feet. A few days later, we convened in Helena's conference room. Victor arrived with his own attorney, a younger man with polished shoes and the overly assertive expression of someone who had not yet learned how often documents outlive confidence. Ryan came too. Lauren stayed home, probably wise. Helena placed both wills side by side, the outdated one, the final one. Then she read the execution dates, witness certifications, and filing records, one by one, calmly. Victor attempted performance. He said Daniel had been confused near the end. Helena slid across a neurological evaluation showing no cognitive impairment. Victor claimed there must have been improper influence. Helena produced billing records, witness affidavits, and dated correspondence indicating Daniel initiated every change himself. Procedure did not raise its voice. It just kept arriving. Victor's attorney asked whether I intended to pursue criminal complaints based on the financial materials Daniel had assembled. Helena looked at me. I said, "Not today. Not because I was merciful. Because structure works best when people understand the alternatives without being chased by them." Then Helena presented the transfer options. Option 1. I retain all real estate and business interests, and the sons receive nothing. Option 2. I gift them the Bellevue residence and mountain property, subject to all attached obligations, with no indemnity from me and no future claim against liquid estate reserves. Victor took the packet and turned pale halfway through. He wasn't expecting that answer. "The debt transfers?" he asked. "Yes," Helena said. "All of it?" "Yes." Ryan looked from page to page as if the numbers might rearrange into mercy if he blinked often enough. "This would ruin us," he said. Helena did not answer. Lawyers learn early that some statements are not questions. I did answer. "You should have considered that before trying to rush a widow through obsolete paperwork." No one spoke after that for several seconds. Authority doesn't come from saying something first. That was the line that settled in the room. I didn't plan it. It simply arrived. Victor tried one more move. He said they had been trying to help me avoid liabilities. Helena slid forward the actual insurance documents. Not 280,000. 800,000 across combined policies, all designated correctly. Then she produced the letters, showing no direct personal assignment of the largest medical obligations in the way Victor had implied. Victor's lawyer looked up and paused. I saw it then, plainly. He knew they had overplayed their hand. After the meeting, the social lane moved again. Word travels strangely in affluent neighborhoods. Not as gossip, exactly. More like climate. The building manager at one of Daniel's commercial properties suddenly became much more formal with Victor. A long-time vendor copied me directly on an invoice question, instead of sending it to Ryan. Joanne from next door stopped by with lemon bars and said, "I'm glad someone is finally using the proper channels." There it was. Community rumor in its most respectable clothing. On the financial side, institutional tightening began. The title company placed final hold notices on transfer attempts tied to the obsolete will. One brokerage sent an alert regarding attempted inquiry access from an unauthorized intermediary. Helena's office responded with a cease communication directive. A compliance team at Daniel's private bank requested written affirmation of sole authority and placed a watch on any external representation using old estate summaries. Nothing looked dramatic from the outside. No sirens, no shouting, just tightening. Victor moved from performance to anger. Ryan moved from confusion to fear. Then, eventually, both moved toward compliance. Victor called and said we could find a middle ground. I asked him what middle ground he thought existed between pressure built on obsolete paperwork and documented authority. He didn't answer that. Ryan sent a message at 11:41 night. "Please don't destroy us over a misunderstanding." I read it once and set the phone down. Misunderstanding is a useful word for people who mean decision. A week later, they accepted the transfer package. Not joyfully, not graciously, but formally. Helena had the acceptance signed, notarized, and recorded with all attached debt instruments acknowledged. There were also waivers. No future claims against me. No occupancy assumptions. No challenges to liquid estate control. No contact, except through counsel on asset matters. I signed my portions with a pen. Helena handed me across the table. Outside, rain tapped softly against the office windows. Inside, pages turned, initials placed. Dates entered. Quiet structural resolution often sounds like paper. In the weeks that followed, the financial lane kept doing what financial lanes do. Victor and Ryan were unable to refinance. The lenders did not care about family narratives. They cared about income, ratios, exposure, timing. The mountain property went first. Then the house entered distress. Then the commercial parcel's obligations accelerated under terms Daniel had clearly selected, with a very precise sense of human weakness. Escrow doesn't recognize assumptions. I thought that more than once. On the social side, the family version of events began to collapse under its own contradictions. Lauren moved out before the end of summer. Joanne told me, gently and without naming sources, that Victor had been seen leaving a counselling office more than once, looking like a man trying to bargain with air. Ryan took contract work somewhere south of Tacoma and stopped presenting himself as an executive anything. I did not celebrate. That surprises some people when they hear a version of this story. They expect triumph to feel loud. Mine didn't. It felt clean. About 3 months later, I sold what I chose to sell, retained what I chose to retain, and bought a smaller house near Gig Harbor, with a view of the water through cedar trees. Not grand. Just right. A house with deep windowsills, a practical kitchen, and a garden that had been left alone long enough to be grateful for attention. One morning in October, I was kneeling in the side yard, loosening compacted soil around an old hydrangea, when I realized an entire hour had passed without me thinking about Victor or Ryan at all. That was the moment ordinary life returned. It wasn't dramatic either, just a hand in dirt, cool air in my lungs, and the sound of crows somewhere above the cedar line. Later that winter, I met with a small non-profit in Tacoma that helped older women understand property transfers, account access, beneficiary designations, and what to do when family starts using urgency as a tactic. I didn't give a speech. I sat at a folding table with a yellow legal pad and answered questions. One woman asked, "How did you know when to stop explaining yourself?" I thought about that for a second. Then I told her, when I realized explanation was being used to delay recognition. She wrote it down. Sometimes people mistake silence for permission. Near the end of all this, I came to understand the opposite is also true. Calm is not surrender. Quiet is not weakness. And paper, when it is honest and timely and properly recorded, can be a kinder form of justice than rage ever is. Daniel knew that. In the last letter he left me, there was a line I didn't fully understand until much later. He wrote, "If they force everything into structure, structure will answer them back." It did. I still keep that letter in the top drawer of my desk, along with the brass key that started all of it. Some evenings I make tea and sit by the window facing west, where the light comes in softer here than it did in Bellevue. Not better, just softer. The kind of light that doesn't expose so much as settle. I think about Daniel then, about the bread in the paper bag, the blanket in the den, the way he used to tap a document twice before signing it, as if paper deserved one final chance to explain itself. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. These days, my life is smaller in the best sense. Fewer rooms, fewer performances. More things that can be tended by hand. And when I think back to that first afternoon in Daniel's study, to Victor standing there with his folder and his timelines and his missing authority, I no longer remember feeling defeated. I remember noticing. That's the part that matters. Because in the end, the mistake they made was a simple one. They thought silence meant they could proceed. What they learned, a little too late, was that silence was only the moment I began reading more carefully.